That night, the ER exploded with chaos. 7 wounded soldiers poured in, blood flooding the floor. Nurses dropped instruments. Doctors shouted over each other. Monitors screamed continuously. Military police barked, "At all costs, save the young captain, the general's son." Clara pressed against the wall, memories flooding back. 12 years ago, she'd watched helplessly as her closest comrade died on the operating table, blood covering her hands. Since then, she'd buried Valkyrie. But the young captain's heart stopped. The monitor flatlined. The room erupted in panic. Clara broke down crying, her hands trembling, then roared, "Silence! Everyone follow my lead, now!" The hands known as the Hand of God returned. A doctor stammered in shock, "My God, Colonel Surgeon Valkyrie?" Clara Hayes, 38 years old, worked as a nurse at a small city military hospital. Appearance? Brown hair tied low, sad eyes, thin small frame, blue scrubs always clean but worn. For 12 years, colleagues saw her as a shadow, diligent but nameless. Young nurses often mocked, "Nurse Hayes only knows how to mop floors and dispense pills." No different from support staff. Clara just smiled faintly, silently continuing her work. Kind actions, helping elderly patients sit up, giving water to young soldiers, picking up dropped syringes. Occasionally, the on-call doctor saw her writing strange symbols in a small notebook, whispering, "Old-fashioned." Her past. Clara had been a colonel, NATO battlefield surgeon, call sign Valkyrie, nicknamed the Hand of God, for saving hundreds of soldiers' lives over 72 continuous hours. 12 years ago, a horrific explosion took nearly all her team. Clara personally witnessed her closest comrade die on the operating table, blood gushing while her hands couldn't save him. Psychological trauma. For the first time, the divine hands were powerless. She collapsed, left military medicine. The government recorded Valkyrie died in action. Clara survived, changed her name, chose to work as an ordinary nurse to escape her past. Witness trace. An elderly patient recounted, she was quiet, but her eyes like she'd witnessed death too many times. The military hospital in Fort Carson was a modest facility, nothing like the state-of-the-art trauma centers at major bases. It served local veterans, active duty personnel from the nearby training grounds, and occasionally handled overflow from larger facilities. Clara had worked there for 8 years. Before that, she drifted through civilian hospitals under her new identity, always keeping her head down, never standing out. Her colleagues knew almost nothing about her. She lived alone in a small apartment, had no social media presence, declined after-work gatherings, and spoke rarely beyond what was necessary for patient care. Marcus Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, found her competent but unremarkable. "Hayes is reliable," he'd tell new staff. "She won't dazzle you, but she won't let you down either." The younger nurses were less kind. Sarah Chen, 24 and fresh from nursing school, had openly complained, "Why is Hayes even here? She just does the bare minimum, never volunteers for extra shifts, never participates in training exercises. It's like she's sleepwalking through the job." Another nurse had laughed, "Maybe she's just burned out. Some people coast until retirement." But there were moments when Clara's facade cracked slightly. Once, during a minor emergency, a young soldier had been brought in with a gunshot wound from a training accident. The resident on duty had been fumbling, unsure how to pack the wound properly. Clara had stepped forward, her hands moving with sudden precision, showing him the correct technique without a word. The bleeding had stopped immediately. The resident had looked at her with surprise. "How did you know how to do that?" "Experience," Clara had said quietly, then walked away. Dr. Webb had noticed. Later, he'd pulled her file, found nothing unusual. Born in Ohio, nursing degree from a community college. Standard references, nothing that explained those hands that had moved like a surgeon's. He'd asked her once, "Hayes, did you ever work trauma before this?" "A long time ago," she'd replied. "Different life." He hadn't pushed. Everyone had a past they'd rather not discuss. What Webb didn't know, what no one knew, was that Clara kept a small notebook in her locker. Inside were medical notes, surgical techniques, tactical trauma protocols. She updated them constantly, an unconscious habit from her years as Valkyrie. She told herself she'd never use them again. That part of her life was dead. But muscle memory doesn't forget, and neither do hands that once held the power of life and death. One elderly veteran who'd been a patient multiple times would later tell reporters, "I knew there was something different about Nurse Hayes. The way she moved, so efficient. The way she looked at monitors, reading them like a language. And her eyes, they'd seen things. You can always tell when someone's been in combat. She had that look. I just never imagined she was the Valkyrie." A military vehicle explosion near the barracks. Wounded soldiers flooded into the ER. Sirens wailing throughout the hospital. The atmosphere was chaotic. Blood on the floor, the smell of disinfectant mixed with gunpowder smoke. A young officer, the son of the Corps general, was brought in. His abdomen torn open, blood spurting in streams. Military police blocked the door, ordering, "At all costs, save him. The general is on his way." The lead doctor shouted, "Suction! Faster!" Another yelled, "Clamp the artery now!" A nurse's hands shook, the instrument tray clattering. Monitors screamed continuously, heart rate plummeting. Clara stood pressed in the corner, her heart constricting, memories of her comrade's death 12 years ago flooding back. She whispered, "I can't. I buried Valkyrie." But then the young captain convulsed. The monitor flatlined. Screams filled the room. Clara trembled violently, tears falling, then roared like thunder. "Estifa! Everyone follow my lead, now!" She lunged to the operating table, grabbed the clamp, stopped the artery precisely. The bleeding stopped. She fired orders. "Adrenaline 1 milligram, pressure left side, pack the wound, now." Her movements were precise as a blade, so fast that everyone held their breath. The heartbeat returned, monitor beeping. Beep, beep, beep. The operating room froze. A young doctor stammered, "My God, she's not an ordinary nurse." A medical attendant later recounted, "I was shaking uncontrollably, but when I heard that voice, I worked like a soldier in barracks, like there was a real commander there." The explosion had happened at 2100 hours during a routine equipment transport. An IED planted by insurgents during a training exercise gone wrong, or sabotage, no one was sure yet. 7 casualties, 3 critical, 4 serious but stable. Captain Michael Hayes, 26 years old, son of General Robert Hayes, commander of the Western Military District, was critical. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, severing his superior mesenteric artery and puncturing his small intestine in multiple places. He was bleeding out. The ambulance had called ahead. General's son, critical abdominal trauma, massive hemorrhage. ETA 4 minutes. Dr. Webb had mobilized everyone available. All hands on deck. This wasn't just another soldier. This was political. This was personal. This was a general's son, and if they lost him, there would be hell to pay. When Michael was wheeled in, Clara had been in the supply room, restocking IV bags. She'd heard the commotion, the urgent voices, and had frozen. "Not again," her mind whispered. "Please, not again." She'd forced herself to walk to the doorway, to observe. Just observe. She wasn't part of the trauma team. She was just a floor nurse. But then she'd seen him, young, dark hair, pale face, blood everywhere. And she'd seen Dr. Webb's hands shaking, seen the resident fumbling with the clamps, seen the nurses panicking as blood pressure dropped. They were going to lose him. Clara had felt her own hands begin to shake, felt the room tilt, felt herself transported back 12 years to another operating room, another young soldier, another catastrophic wound. Lieutenant James Morrison, her best friend, the man who'd saved her life twice in combat, the man she'd promised to save. She'd failed. His blood had covered her hands as she tried desperately to repair damage that was simply too extensive. She'd worked for 2 hours straight, refusing to give up, even when everyone else had known it was hopeless. When he'd finally died, something inside Clara had died too. The hands that had saved hundreds couldn't save the one person who mattered most. She'd left military medicine that night, changed her name, disappeared, became no one. Now, watching another young man dying on the same kind of table, Clara felt the walls closing in. I can't, she whispered to herself. I can't do this again. Michael convulsed. The monitor screamed, then went silent as his heart stopped. He's in arrest, Dr. Webb shouted. Start compressions. Get me the crash cart. But the compressions were sloppy. The resident didn't have the experience. They were losing precious seconds. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, felt her whole body trembling. Then she heard a voice. James's voice, from 12 years ago, from beyond death. You couldn't save me, but you can save him. Don't let what happened to me stop you from being who you are. Something broke inside Clara, not breaking apart, but breaking free. She stepped forward. Silence! Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everyone follow my lead, now! The room froze. Every head turned toward her. Dr. Webb started to protest. Hayes, you're not... I'm Colonel Clara Hayes, battlefield surgeon. Call sign Valkyrie, she snapped. Her voice transformed from timid to commanding. And if you want this boy to live, you'll do exactly what I say. Now move aside. She'd pushed past the resident, her hands already reaching for instruments. The muscle memory was instant, perfect, as if 12 years had never passed. Clamp the superior mesenteric artery. Now. Her hands showed them where, moved so fast they could barely track it. The bleeding slowed. Adrenaline, 1 milligram, IV push. A nurse, wide-eyed, complied instantly. Pressure on the left side of the abdomen. Pack the wound with gauze. More. Keep it coming. Her hands worked with impossible speed and precision, finding bleeding vessels, clamping them, suturing, moving to the next. Every motion was economical, perfect, the result of thousands of hours of trauma surgery under fire. Someone start bagging him. Respiratory support, we need oxygen now. The anesthesiologist, who'd been standing frozen, snapped to action. Within 90 seconds, the bleeding was controlled, the wounds packed, the patient stabilizing. The monitor beeped back to life. Weak at first, then stronger. Michael's heart was beating again. Clara didn't stop. She continued working, repairing damage, suturing vessels, cleaning debris from the wounds. Her hands moved like they'd never forgotten, like they'd been waiting 12 years to do this again. The operating room was completely silent, except for the beeping monitor and Clara's calm, steady voice issuing instructions. Dr. Webb watched in stunned amazement. He'd been practicing emergency medicine for 20 years. He'd never seen anything like this. 45 minutes later, Michael was stable, critical but alive. Clara stepped back from the table, pulled off her bloody gloves, and only then seemed to realize what she'd done. Her legs gave out. She caught herself on the table edge. Valkyrie, Dr. Webb whispered. You're the Valkyrie. Clara looked at him, tears and blood streaking her face, and nodded. I was. I am. I don't know anymore. News spread throughout the hospital. Nurse Hayes saved the general's son using techniques no one has ever seen. But what shocked everyone wasn't just the save, it was the way she commanded like military orders, her surgical skills transcendent. A veteran doctor whispered, this style, I've witnessed it before. This is Valkyrie, the hand of God. Young colleagues gaped. Impossible! Valkyrie died 12 years ago? Clara remained silent, then looked up, eyes pained. I am Valkyrie. I never died. Her true identity revealed, a living legend, the Colonel Battlefield Surgeon, who'd been written into military medical history. The young doctor who'd mocked Clara fell silent, now bowing his head, stammering, I called a hero useless. In the operating room, everyone fell silent, following Clara's every order until the rescue operation ended. The young captain survived. Military police stood stunned, saluting Clara. News leaked to the barracks. Valkyrie never died. She's been among us. Within an hour, the hospital was in controlled chaos. General Robert Hayes arrived by helicopter, accompanied by a full security detail. He'd received word mid-flight that his son was stable, saved by an unknown nurse who turned out to be legendary. He demanded to meet her immediately. Clara was in the staff locker room washing blood from her hands for the third time. They still felt stained. They always felt stained after James died. But this time was different. This time she'd save someone. Dr. Webb found her there. "Clara, the general wants to see you, Danny." "Oh, I know," she said quietly. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years you were here and we never knew." Clara looked at him. "Because Valkyrie died 12 years ago. I wanted her to stay dead." "But she's not dead." "No," Clara agreed. "I guess she's not." The meeting with General Hayes was brief and emotional. The general, a hard man who'd commanded thousands in combat, broke down crying when he saw Clara. "You saved my son," he managed. "I'm sorry it took so long," Clara said. "I should have been here sooner." "You're here now, that's what matters." But the revelation went far beyond one grateful father. Word spread to NATO Medical Command, to the Pentagon, to military hospitals across the world where Clara's legend had never died. Valkyrie lives confirmed. She's at Fort Carson. Within hours, Clara's phone, which she'd barely used in years, started ringing. Old comrades, former patients, military brass. She ignored all of it. Sarah Chen, the young nurse who'd mocked Clara, found her in the supply room, stocking shelves like nothing had happened. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I said terrible things. I had no idea." "You had no reason to know," Clara said gently. "I hid who I was on purpose." "But why? You're amazing. You saved that man's life." "You're a hero." Clara turned to look at her. "Sarah, do you know why I left military medicine?" Sarah shook her head. "Because I lost someone I couldn't save. My best friend. I was the best battlefield surgeon in NATO, and I couldn't save the one person who mattered most. That failure destroyed me. I ran away from who I was because I couldn't face that loss." She picked up another box of supplies. "So I became no one. A floor nurse who mops and dispenses pills. Because if I was no one, I couldn't fail anyone important again." "But you didn't fail tonight." "No," Clara agreed. "Tonight I didn't fail. And maybe that means I can forgive myself for the time I did." The hospital administrator called an emergency staff meeting. Clara was asked to attend. Dr. Webb spoke first. "I think we all owe Nurse Hayes, or rather Colonel Hayes, an apology. We underestimated her, dismissed her, and tonight she showed us what real excellence looks like." He turned to Clara. "On behalf of this hospital, I'm offering you the position of Chief of Trauma Surgery. Full credentials, full authority, full support." Clara shook her head. "I appreciate it, but no, I'm a nurse. That's who I chose to be." "But you're a surgeon, one of the best who ever lived." "I was a surgeon. Now I'm a nurse. And that's okay. Both are valuable. Both save lives." She looked around the room at faces that ranged from awed to ashamed to confused. "What I did tonight, I did because someone needed help and I could provide it. That's what medical professionals do, regardless of their title. Nurse, doctor, surgeon, it doesn't matter. We all serve patients. That's the only thing that matters." The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the entire staff was applauding. Clara felt tears on her face again. But this time they weren't tears of grief or trauma. They were tears of something else. Something she hadn't felt in 12 years. Peace. That night after her shift, Clara walked to the hospital chapel. She sat in the quiet darkness and thought about James. "I saved someone tonight," she whispered. "I think you'd be proud. I think you'd tell me it's time to stop punishing myself for not saving you. I think you'd tell me that my hands are still a gift, even if they couldn't save you." She closed her eyes. "I'm going to try to live again. Really live. Not just exist. I don't know if I'll go back to surgery. Maybe, maybe not. But I'm going to stop hiding. I'm going to stop being ashamed of who I am." The chapel was silent, but Clara felt something shift inside her. A weight lifting, a burden releasing. For the first time in 12 years, she felt like herself again. Outside the chapel, Dr. Webb and several other staff members had gathered. They'd followed Clara, wanting to make sure she was okay. When she emerged, she saw them and smiled. "I'm fine, really." "We know who you are now," Dr. Webb said, "and we're honored to work with you, however you want to contribute. Nurse, surgeon, consultant, mentor. Whatever you choose, we're grateful you're here." Clara nodded. Then I choose to keep being a nurse, with maybe some surgical consulting on the side. But I'm not putting on the white coat again. I'm comfortable where I am. Understood and respected. As Clara walked to her car, she passed the memorial wall in the hospital lobby. It listed military medical personnel who'd died in service. Her name was there. Colonel Clara Hayes, call sign Valkyrie, KIA. She stared at it for a long moment, then smiled sadly. Not quite killed, she whispered. Just lost for a while. But I think I'm found now. News exploded. Valkyrie returns, not on the battlefield, but in the operating room. Young soldiers wrote letters. You're the reason we believe life can still be reclaimed. The old general choked up. You didn't just save my son. You saved this entire military spirit. The young doctor who'd mocked her posted publicly, I was wrong. The person I dismissed was the legend we'd mourned. The symbol returned, call sign Valkyrie, no longer about war, but about hope, courage, kindness. People hung flags telling the next generation there was a female doctor who saved an entire corps and now saves all of us. The story spread beyond the hospital within days. Military news networks picked it up first. Legendary battlefield surgeon resurfaces after 12 years. Then civilian media. The hand of God. How a war hero hid as a nurse. Social media exploded. Veterans who'd been saved by Valkyrie came forward with their stories. She saved my life in Afghanistan, one former Marine posted. I was going to die. Everyone knew it, except her. She worked on me for 3 hours straight under fire. I'm alive today because of Colonel Hayes. Learning she's alive, that she's been here all along, it's a miracle. Hundreds more stories followed, each one a testimony to Clara's skill, dedication, and courage during her years as a battlefield surgeon. But the most profound impact was on military medical personnel currently serving. She proved that trauma doesn't have to end your career, one trauma nurse wrote. She proved that you can be broken, walk away, and still find your way back. That's the most important lesson for those of us dealing with PTSD and moral injury. Medical schools incorporated her story into ethics curricula, not as a tale of heroism, but as a case study in the cost of healing and the possibility of redemption. Fort Carson's military hospital was flooded with applications from medical professionals who wanted to work where Valkyrie worked, nurses, doctors, surgeons, all inspired by her story. Clara declined most interview requests, but she agreed to speak to military medical students once. She stood before a lecture hall of 300 future doctors and nurses and told her truth. I was the best. Everyone said so. The hand of Ba. I saved hundreds of lives, but when I couldn't save my best friend, I fell apart. I ran away, I hid. For 12 years, I told myself I was finished, that I couldn't bear to lose anyone else. She paused, looking at the young faces before her. What I learned is this. You will lose patience. You will fail. You will face situations where your skills aren't enough and it will break your heart. But that doesn't mean you stop. It means you grieve, you learn, you grow, and you keep serving. Because the patients who live need you more than the ones who didn't should define you. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Captain Michael Hayes recovered fully. When he was well enough, he asked to meet Clara privately. I don't remember the surgery, he said, but I remember waking up. And I remember my father telling me that a legend saved my life, a legend who'd been hiding among us all along. I wasn't hiding from you, Clara said gently. I was hiding from myself. Are you still hiding? Clara thought about it. No, I think I'm done hiding. Michael nodded. Good, because the world needs Valkyrie. Maybe not on battlefields anymore, but here, teaching, mentoring, showing others what excellence looks like. General Hayes established a scholarship program in Clara's name, funding military medical training for promising students who'd faced trauma or adversity. Because she showed us that broken can heal, he explained at the announcement ceremony. And healers who've been broken understand healing in ways others can't. The military removed Clara's name from the KIA memorial and instead created a new recognition, the Valkyrie Award for Excellence in Military Medicine, given annually to medical personnel who demonstrated extraordinary skill and compassion under pressure. Clara attended the first ceremony, watched a young trauma nurse receive the award. felt proud not for herself, but for what the award represented. Recognition that medical heroism comes in many forms. 6 months after the incident, Fort Carson's hospital dedicated a new trauma wing. Named, despite Clara's protests, the Valkyrie Center for Emergency Medicine. At the dedication, Dr. Webb said, "This isn't about glorifying one person. It's about honoring what she represents. Second chances, redemption, and the truth that our worst moments don't have to define us." Clara, standing in the crowd, wiped away tears and thought, maybe I can finally let James rest. Maybe I can finally live. If you believe true strength isn't about titles, type, "I will live with kindness." Clara declined interviews, continuing to wear her blue nurse scrubs, quietly cleaning operating rooms after shifts. People only remembered what she'd shouted that day. "Silence! Follow my lead now!" A doctor whispered, that wasn't just a command, it was a resurrection. The lesson? True strength lies not in rank, but in the courage to act at the right moment. The symbolic closure, Valkyrie, the hand of God, from battlefield to hospital, became a legacy of courage. 2 years later, Clara was still working at Fort Carson, still wearing blue scrubs, still calling herself a nurse. But she'd made one concession. She taught trauma surgery 2 days a month to military medical residents. Not as Colonel Hayes, but as Nurse Clara, who happened to have some surgical experience. Her teaching style was different from other instructors. Less theoretical, more practical, focused entirely on keeping patients alive in impossible situations. Your job isn't to be perfect, she'd tell students. Your job is to do everything possible and then live with the outcome. Success or failure, you did your best. That has to be enough. One young resident asked her, "Do you still think about the patients you lost?" "Every day," Clara answered honestly. "Especially James, my best friend, the one I couldn't save. But I also think about the hundreds I did save. Both matter. Both are part of who I am." She paused. "For 12 years, I only remembered the one I lost. Now I try to remember all of them. That's how I survive." Sarah Chen, the nurse who'd once mocked Clara, became one of her closest friends and greatest advocates. "She changed how I see nursing," Sarah told a medical journal interviewing his staff. "I used to think it was a lesser role. Now I understand it's just a different role, equally valuable, equally demanding. And sometimes the nurses know things doctors don't." Clara's apartment remained small and simple, but she'd added something, a wall of photos. Soldiers she'd saved over the years, letters they'd sent, thank you cards from families. And in the center, a photo of James Morrison, smiling in his uniform, young and alive and full of promise. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," Clara whispered to the photo sometimes. "But I'm trying to honor you by saving others. I hope that's enough." She'd also started writing. Not a memoir, but a trauma surgery manual specifically designed for combat conditions. Practical, blunt, based on her years of experience. Valkyrie's Protocols, it was called. It became required reading for military medical personnel worldwide. On the anniversary of James's death, Clara visited his grave for the first time in 12 years. She'd avoided it before, unable to face the physical reminder of her failure. Now she stood before the headstone, tears flowing freely. "I'm doing better," she told him. "I saved that kid, the general's son, and I've saved others since. I'm teaching now, passing on what you and I learned together." She touched the cold stone. "I'll never stop missing you, but I'm going to stop punishing myself. You wouldn't want that. You'd want me to keep living, keep helping, keep being who I was born to be." She stood there until sunset, then walked away feeling lighter than she had in years. Clara Hayes would never return to active military surgery, but she didn't need to. Her legacy was already established, her impact already permanent. The hand of God had returned, not with scalpels on battlefields, but with compassion in hospital corridors, teaching, mentoring, healing not just patients but herself. And that, she finally understood, was enough. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.